Hi guys, thanks for joining me in this quick lecture evaluating Louise Archer's research on Nike Identities. This is a study that you guys should have already done in lesson. Hopefully you've read about her research. If you aren't sure, there is a really good link that I've put on this lecture there. You can use that QR code to scan to get access to that really short video. It's a tutor to you video about identities in schools, and it covers Archer's study in a lot of detail. I think you only need to watch about the first 5 minutes, to be honest with you, just to figure out the core ideas established in her research. This is a picture of Louise Archer, in case you didn't know. Very happy, smiley sociology researcher. She did what's known as ethnographic research. In case any of you aren't sure, ethnography or ethnographic research is when you use a range of qualitative research methods to kind of build a really rich, detailed picture of the group that you're trying to study. Very useful when studying quite closed-off communities or groups that don't really like being studied, perhaps, ones that have had issues with authority figures, for example, in the past, quite often used in crime and deviance, for example. Now, it's because ethnographic research is all qualitative. It means that you can spend the time with these groups and use a range of methods to kind of gain a real true picture of what's going on within those communities. Examples of ethnographic methods would be your unstructured interviews, your group interviews using open questions, and of course all the different observations, both participant, non-participant, covert and overt. I've also put in there documents, okay, which are obviously written documents, photographic documents. They are all social media pages. They're all examples of documents that really can help paint a really rich picture of an individual or a group's ideas, values, beliefs and attitudes. Like I said, today we're going to be evaluating her research, but if you're sat there thinking, oh, I can't remember anything about it, just have a quick look at that that video that I've suggested on this slide. So I'd like you to have a read through of the information on this slide and identify what research methods she actually used. I can pick out 4. So I'll go through the bullet points with you and just see what we can draw out. It was a longitudinal study that ran between July 2003 and June 2005. Okay, so that's at least 2 academic years effectively. 89 young people were involved across 6 schools, plus some parents and some school staff. Now, 89 isn't an enormous sample when you compare it to the size of the whole country, but bearing in mind this is ethnographic research, which obviously, looking at the methods, they take a long time to carry out those types of bits of research. That is a pretty big sample for ethnography. So yes, you can say not very representative. However, for the nature of the methods used, it is definitely quite a representative bit of research for the particular community they are studying. And actually, if I nip you down to the second from the bottom bullet point, it is worth mentioning that they really were focusing on students that were at risk of dropping out of education. Okay, so they were focusing very much on that cohort. So you can definitely generalise the findings of this study to those students. You can't really generalise the findings of this study to, say, middle-class students, okay? Some middle class, but not many, perhaps, because they're less likely to drop out of education, perhaps, according to statistics. She used a mixture of qualitative methods, including individual student interviews, which were like semi-structured, staff members interviews, parents, student discussion groups, which I would call group interviews, and photo diaries. All of the schools served deprived areas and excluded communities. Not predominantly, but quite a lot of ethnic minority communities were definitely included in the research. North London, East London to West London, and all of the schools had below the national average of GCSE results. Okay, so these were schools that were perhaps struggling. In terms of other characteristics of the sample, much higher proportion of young people from a minority ethnic background for whom English is an additional language, a lot more working class students, a higher proportion of special educational needs students, and the schools themselves had high staff turnover and problems recruiting teachers. So these really were schools that weren't necessarily doing particularly well. Which you might say from a practical point of view would mean that the head teachers would not want their research being done because it does paint the school in quite a negative light. However, I think most of the head teachers that agreed were quite enlightened and realised that there were problems in the school and they needed to figure out what on earth was causing them. So her research is a good example of access being granted to quite a sensitive, complex topic, probably because head teachers really wanted to help this group of students stay in school and do better, because ultimately that does improve their league table position. Again, tracked over 2 years, semi-structured interviews for 3 to 4 years. Interviews depended on the change in circumstances. So, for example, when they were first encountered the sample, they might interview them at school. Many of these young people ended up being excluded, so they ended up in pupil referral units, so the interviews would take place there. Some of them wouldn't even be in pupil referral units, would be interviewed in cafes. So if you can remember that detail, you might want to have a think about where do you think they would be the most honest about their experiences of schooling. Researching identity in schools is a very complicated topic. It is very hard for me to even articulate my own identity, let alone interview a young person and figure out how they form their identity, what's important to them, how other people view them, the symbols that mean a lot to them. So hence why I think ethnography is a really good approach to get to the bottom of these communities. In case you haven't picked it out, the research methods used were in-depth repeat interviews, and it does say semi-structured. What that means is there would have been a loose framework of questions to ask at each interview. Now, bearing in mind this is a longitudinal study, so it happened over a number of months and a couple of years. However, the conversation would have flowed like a free-flowing, unstructured interview. Okay, so they might have asked a set question at the beginning, but then they'd have asked lead-on questions, they'd have talked on different topics, so rapport would have been quite easy to establish, I think, in these types of interviews. So even though it's semi-structured, I would say it's very much an unstructured interview format. 2 years returning with the same group, it makes this a longitudinal study, a study that's done in over a long period of time. Really useful way of studying the impact of changes such as social changes, political changes, or just changes in like the age of the people who are being interviewed. In this case, it was interviewed young people as they moved from, if you like, year 9 up into year 11, which is a significant period of change when it comes to identity, the role of the peer group, achievement, all types of things that can interfere positively or negatively with a student's achievement. Photographic diaries, this is a type of personal document, so yeah, that's secondary data using personal documents, and photographs are a type of document. You can tell a lot from a person by the things that they take photos of, things that are important to them, stuff that's going on in their lives, the role of friends, the role of different status symbols associated with products, fashion, all sorts. Really helps build a rich picture about what someone's like. And finally, discussion groups, which effectively means group interviews. So what I would like you to do for today's lesson is to assess the use of each of the methods she used to investigate how schools can impact student identity and perhaps, as a result, achievement. One thing I just want to make super clear to you all is that identity and achievement are two very different things, but of course can be really closely linked. Identity, again, like I said, is how you see yourself, how others see you. Achievement is very much about how you do in exams, for example, how you do in tests. However, it is worth mentioning, for example, being high achieving in a class or low achieving in a class can have an impact on your identity. If you have a sense that you're not doing particularly well, that can leave you with a negative self-identity, low self-esteem, and can obviously lead to you forming a particular type of deviant subculture, perhaps anti-school subculture. However, if you're doing well, you feel like you score well in tests, you've got good predictions for your exams, that's far more likely to have a positive impact, a different impact on your identity, not necessarily positive. You might join a different type of peer group. You'll view yourself in a very different way. You might have very different interests, perhaps more academic interests, involved in the school interests, as opposed to someone who perhaps feels very negative about school life, might have very different interests, might not be so interested in school pursuits, might want to spend a bit more time off-site, for example. Okay, so in terms of the 4 areas I'd like you to make notes on now, and I'm thinking at least 2 sides of A4 for this evaluation. Strengths of weaknesses of using semi or unstructured interviews to research identity and achievement. So try and link as many of your points to identity and achievement, because that'll push it towards band 4, band 5. Just general strengths and weaknesses of Archer's research. I mentioned earlier on that it's arguably unrepresentative because it only had 89 people in it. So that's a general evaluation. It's not linked to the particular method. However, if I then said, however, it is very representative considering its ethnographic methods, such as unstructured interviews, which generally take a long period of time, to interview 89 people in that way does actually make it quite representative using that research method. I'm pushing a little bit closer to band 4, not quite band 5, because you have to link it to identity and achievement to get it to that point. Strengths and weaknesses of using personal documents, in this case it was photo diaries, and strengths and weaknesses of using group interviews. Like I said, try and link as many of your evaluation points to either identity formation in school or achievement patterns in school. Okay, so that's where what I'd like you to do first. This should take you a good 20 minutes to half an hour. You'll need Louise Archer's study in front of you. You can flick back to the slide before to read about the methodology. And then once you've done that, I've got one more thing for you to do on the next slide. So pause it here, but don't forget to do the next slide. So the final thing I'm asking you guys to do is an AO3. I'm looking for you to compare and contrast Louise Archer's study with Sue Sharp's and Paul Willis's. Okay, so Sue Sharp did her research comparing, I think it was it 1960s to the 1980s? Or maybe it was 1970s to 1990s. Apologies, it slipped my mind at the moment. She found that girls' aspirations had changed over that 20-year period of time. Can you remind yourselves in your notes, what had they changed from and to? Like, what was their most important aspiration now compared to what it was when the study was first done? Her research method was a structured interview. She asked exactly the same question, which was to put those things in order, if you can remember, in order of most to least important. So things like careers, having a family, I can't remember any other ones. Careers, having a family, getting married, going on to further study. She asked exactly the same question, asked the girls to put them in the same in order of most to least important. So that makes it a structured interview. And what I'd like you to do is explain in your notes, why is this a better or worse methodological approach compared to Louise Archer's ethnographic approach using qualitative methods? It definitely is better, according to positivists. Try and think what they would say. But why would perhaps interpretatives say, no, it's not a very good method? Okay. Archer found that what Sue Sharp found out, and hopefully you remember that, didn't apply to working class girls, okay? For example, how did she find the working class girls felt about, particularly about their family and about the importance of the relationships they were in? Like, how did working class girls feel about their boyfriends in her study, for example? And how was that different to what Sue Sharp found with the girls that she did her structured interview with? And how did the working class girls in the Archer's research, how did they view going to university, which again contrasts quite strongly with what Sharp found out among girls? Secondly, again, thinking about Paul Willis, how is Archer's research really similar to what Paul Willis found out? And the clue is something to do with subcultures. They focused on slightly different groups, but they found something very similar. But Archer did focus on a different group. Who? Okay, so there's something in common, but there was something that was significantly different about the groups that she focused on. And what did Archer find was the cause of failure? So the actual cause of failure for Archer, and this is academic failure, this isn't identity formation I'm talking about, was different to what Paul Willis found. And just remind yourself, what did Paul Willis find was the cause of the counter-school boys' failure, apart from actually being in a subculture? Why was it that those boys did not value education? Okay, where did that come from? Which is different to what Archer found as the cause of failure. Okay, guys, thanks so much for listening for this lesson. We'll be reviewing what notes you've made on this slide and the previous one, evaluating her research, in the next lesson.